Okay, I think that is everyone. Thank you all for coming to this webinar. This is going to be an exploration of one of the studies we have done at Faunalytics about the New Roots Institute as a case study to help us understand food system education as a whole and how it can benefit the movement. So we're going to do a 5 to 10 minute explanation of the study results. And then after that, we're going to have a short panel with our two guests, both from the New Roots Institute. You could also ask me questions as well about the study for about 20 minutes or so. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can put them into the group chat or you can ask them and unmute yourself afterwards. Before we jump into the results, we can introduce ourselves and talk about our backgrounds. So my name is Björn. I'm here representing Faunalytics. At Faunalytics, I work one-on-one with advocates to help them understand all of the data that we have here at Faunalytics. So I work one-on-one, I do webinars, I do conferences, I write blog posts, basically whatever I can do to make the information and data more understandable and easier to be implemented in people's everyday work. Because without the data, without the evidence, sometimes we're going to choose less optimal strategies or not use an intervention as effectively as it could be. So that's what I'm passionate about, is using the data to make advocacy even better. So I have two guests with us today. We have Tanwi Wangikar and Lauren Ferrucci, both from the New Roots Institute. I would like both of you to briefly introduce yourselves and what you do. Let's start with Tanwi.
Thanks so much, Bjorn. Hi, my name is Tanwi, and I'm a Leadership Development Coordinator at New Roots Institute. To briefly introduce myself, I first started working with New Roots Institute as a college student in one of our fellowship programs. This was in spring of 2022, and the program has changed a lot since then. But since then, I've worked in the capacity of a teaching fellow, so like a part-time educator within the fellowship. And now I work full-time to facilitate the fellowship from the inside. And I'm very excited to be here today to unpack some of the results of this study and talk more about how we can apply them and take them beyond the study itself. And I'm located in Chicago, Illinois.
Thanks, Tanwi. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm the Director of Programs here at New Roots Institute. I'm based in Stamford, Connecticut. I've been with New Roots for just over a year now, and I come from a background previously in the tech world. At New Roots, I help us to look after both our educational outreach programs and our fellowship programs, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. So thanks so much, Faunalytics, for having us and for helping to run this study.
Okay, great. If you have questions for either of these two folks, you can begin putting them into the group chat. And now we're going to talk about the study and see what we can learn from our research. So first, how do we analyze this? How do we analyze a giant case study, like basically one program from a big institute like New Roots? So we looked at their food system education fellowship program. This comprised of high school and university students in the United States. And what it comprises of is classroom lectures, communications training, and a leadership program. So it's several weeks of this fellowship. What we reviewed is two primary forms of data collection. One was we reviewed their LinkedIn profiles after they had been. So these are alumni of the program after the fact. We reviewed the LinkedIn profiles to see what they have been up to. And then we also surveyed them, including quantitative and qualitative data. In other words, we asked them numerical data like how often have you done this thing? And then we also asked them for their input, like their opinions on certain aspects of the program and how it is affecting their lives today. So we were hoping when we did the study that it would be positive. We're always hoping for the positive here at Faunalytics, but even when the data isn't positive, we publish it anyway, just because we think it's better to know the truth and act accordingly. In this case, I do think this is a quite optimistic study. We found that after the education program, that all of the students were far more likely to identify as advocates. In particular, environmentalists and animal advocates, but even social justice advocates, as we can see here. And only 2% of people said that they weren't an advocate of any type. after the program, which is quite quite a good finding there. And we did find that the results are statistically significant, meaning that we can be pretty sure that the program had a big cause in making people identify as these advocates. And you might be wondering, why did we look at multiple types of advocacy? Why is it not just animal advocates? Because we are talking about food system education. One of the things that New Roots prioritizes, and I think this will be a big theme of the conversation later, is that the food system requires multiple forms of advocacy to change because it affects multiple types of people and animals and the environment alike. So we wanted to see if this is more likely to affect different aspects of advocacy, like are people more likely to become animal advocates as opposed to environmentalists? And we can see that there are huge bumps in basically everything here. We also found that they are very likely to have pro-animal diets and beliefs, more likely to be vegan and vegetarian. So over 50% are vegan, and only a very small handful are entirely omnivorous. Most of them are either vegetarian or pescatarian if they are not vegan. So obviously that people are making changes in their own lives. That's not going to change the entire system outright, but starting with the individual can lead to broader societal changes after a point in time. So we are seeing success here as well. And then they also held beliefs that were very pro-animal. So this is a series of moral perspective scales that we analyzed for these students. And they had very, very pro-animal beliefs, essentially. They weren't likely to, for example, say that this wasn't their responsibility, how they interact with the food system. They weren't likely to be desensitized to the cruelty that animals are suffering under and things like that. So they do have a very empathetic understanding of animals in our food system. And this is much higher than the average population. So we can see some good successes here as well. If you're curious about reading the entire study results, we will put the link into the group chat and feel free to read it at any time. All of it is public on our website at Faunalytics. So some themes of the report that to me have really stuck out. Number one is intersectionality. As we can see in that first graph, the students are not just one type of advocate. Most of them believe themselves to be multiple types of advocate. And like I said, this is because the food system harms multiple groups. And by having programming that talks about this is allowing students to become more intersectional themselves. And over time, programs like this could make the movement more intersectional. We've explored this theme in other reports, for example, our climate change collaboration report. And this is something that we're passionate about at Faunalytics, is examining these ways that we can collaborate, be intersectional, intertwine issues together, intertwine advocacy methods together. Another one is career support. These students felt that they had been supported in their careers as a result of this programming, and many of them felt they had been exposed to more opportunities. Another one is changing lenses. So this gets back to the idea of intersectionality. And I'm sure we'll have some really great questions for our two guests here today. What are the different ways that educators can put on lenses for their students to examine these issues in ways that our traditional education systems might forget or not really prioritize? And then advocacy effectiveness. The students felt that their advocacy was more effective as a result of this program. So for example, when they're being taught how to communicate effectively with their audiences through the program, they feel as if they are more effective when talking to audiences afterwards. It makes sense, but sometimes when people aren't given this training, they're doing advocacy for months, if not years, and it's not very effective because they just don't know the skills about how to do it correctly. Okay. If you have questions about the study itself, you are free to contact us at Faunalytics. As always, you can come to our office hours to chat about this more. But we would like to open this up to a Q&A so we can chat with our guests about the implications of this study. If you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat. If not, I'm going to ask a couple of my own. So I'm going to start with Tanwi. You have been involved in the leadership development programs in many different ways. You've been a fellow, a teaching fellow, a coordinator. I want you to tell us just how the fellowship works. You know, so we've seen the data about the effectiveness of it, but what does it look like in person? Like, can you help us picture what this really looks like?
Yeah, of course. That's a great question. So to give everyone, I guess, a general understanding of what the fellowship looks like, the way that we've been running it for the last year and probably for the foreseeable future is as a one-year program that's split into three components. The first part of that is our Summer Leadership Academy, which is a 6-week intensive educational fellowship, where fellows really learn in depth about the impacts of factory farming on various different areas, including the environment, social justice issues, public health, so on and so forth, and of course the animal impacts as well. From there, some of them will go on to participate in our academic year fellowship, which takes place in the, I guess, Northern Hemisphere's fall and spring semesters, in line with the fall and spring semesters, like academically. And this is where they take the learnings that they had from over the summer and a lot of the planning and research that they put into their own communities over the summer and action them as campaigns in their own communities. And that can look like a number of different things. Some examples of campaigns we've had in the past and that are currently ongoing are campaigns to institute plant-based defaults in dining halls, to remove surcharges on oat milk at campus cafes or local cafes. And we've currently got some fellows running campaigns with Planted Society to institute vegan restaurant weeks and introduce more plant-based options to local restaurants. So I think the fellowship, what it looks like in person is all these fellows kind of taking these learnings from the online fellowship, because our programming is entirely virtual in order to accommodate all these folks across the country, and then putting them into practice in real life in their own communities, whether that be in their cities or at their campuses and their high schools. They're taking the communication skills that they're learning in our workshops, and they're taking the support that they're gaining for their campaign work through coaching groups and where they're receiving peer support, as well as advisor support from their campaign advisors and from New staff in order to put all of these things into action.
Very exciting. I like thinking about all of the various types of campaigns that they can do after they go through the program, because there are so many ways to engage on a campus or even beyond. Lauren, I want to ask about, so I think that's a good glimpse into the short-term impacts. You know, somebody goes through the program and then they remove the, oat milk upcharge on their entire campus in the year after, like a nice win for the movement. But I want to think a bit more long-term as well. So how do these programs fit within the larger movement? Like, how can this impact us in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question. So I guess we recognize the reality of the world we live in today. There's a lot of countervailing forces that prevent any of us, as we learn about the impacts and implications of factory farming, from making long-term changes. We know that there is a general sentiment that eating meat is right, it's normal, it's natural, it's necessary. We know that the choice architecture in our supermarkets are set up to help us make the choice to eat meat and to eat animal products. We know that there's general attitudes and social norms that support that. And so as we think about the ways in which education can have a long-term impact, we also really think about a lot of what Tanwi was just sharing about how we can also change the structure, the systems that we live in to support long-term choice. So I guess maybe to kind of paint the picture a little bit more, in addition to the leadership development programs that Tanwi spoke about, we also have educational outreach programs where we're going out into classrooms and teaching the general population of students. Many of those students end up joining our leadership development programs. Many of them don't, but they just learn about the impacts and implications of factory farming. And so part of the idea here is that we've got a feedback loop where we're spreading knowledge about the impacts and implications of factory farming and really getting people to understand why it's problematic through a lot of the different angles that you were mentioning, Björn, from a public health perspective, animal ethics, environmental justice, social justice, etc. Then in those same schools, we're also trying to change the structure to allow students to make the easier choice, to make the choice easier for students not to support these industries. And so by doing that in these smaller communities where there's less countervailing forces, that can then start to take hold in other spaces and that can start to spread. So this is really one of the main themes of the work that we're trying to do is by starting in these smaller communities, that can then spread and take hold. The other piece of what we're looking at is how we position these students to become lifelong advocates. And so we know that they are going to go off and work in a variety of different fields, whether that be nonprofits, whether that be government, whether that be the corporate world. And in any of these different spaces, they're going to be able to take some of what they've learned, the knowledge, the skills, and the training, and apply their work into advocacy in their fields. We've got, I don't want to put you on the spot, Parker, but I see we've got one of our alum here, Parker, who's currently working at the Children's Hospital of Orange County in the events and catering space. And so thinking about how they can apply the knowledge that they've learned about changing our food systems in a children's hospital. So that's sort of another big piece. And then finally, we really are thinking about the ways in which we can connect other organizations and partner with other organizations in the movement. So Tanwi mentioned some of the campaign partners who we're working with, the Planted Society, for example, and how we can make sure that we are really tapping into all of the specialized knowledge across the movement and connecting these organizations with our fellows so that they can have the maximum impact possible. So really thinking long term about how we can work as a connected movement for the maximum impact.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think I've noticed in the last couple of years, the movement, there's been a big push towards this idea of building communities, which is something you touched on just now, Lauren, of instead of targeting individuals, we need to be, I mean, people aren't individuals. We live in a large, it's like the meme. We live in a society, right? Like we live in communities, and only by working with communities are we able to make that longer change. And I think that the programming at New Roots hits at that very nicely. So I want to start getting to the audience questions. We have a bunch here. So Josh has a good question about, is there anything in this report that will change what you do at New Roots? And does anything kind of stand out, surprise you, anything that makes you want to reconsider anything for either of you, whoever has an answer?
I can take first crack, Lauren, if you'd like. Sure. So I think I think we're pretty excited about the results of this report. At least I personally am very excited about the results of this report. And personally, for me, one of the main takeaways of this has been that there is potential to gather a lot more data around these impacts that we are able to have through the fellowship that we maybe haven't been doing in the past. So a big focus that we've had internally within New Roots over the last year and in the upcoming year has been on being really organized about what data we collect, how we collect it, and what we do with that data once we do collect it. I think we're gathering a lot of information about student advocacy in the movement that really isn't being gathered anywhere else. And this enables us to pull out insights like we've been able to do through this report that have the potential to inform our work within New Roots and also outside of New Roots. So I think one of my takeaways here will be to think more deeply about how we can better examine the results of this report, maybe have some better follow through with our fellows once they do leave the program, because we know that we are having long-term impacts through the fellows that are moving through the program. But I think there's room for us to improve how we're following up with them and collecting data and being able to measure that long-term impact, which is a really difficult thing to do. Within the program, I'm seeing a lot of areas where we are like succeeding in having the impact that we do want to have. I was really excited about the impacts on folks' perception of animals. I forget the exact terminology that's used in the report, but those metrics around fellows not having being empathetic towards animals in the food system and having the understanding that their own actions and decisions have an impact on the food system as well, and understanding of their own responsibility within that. I think that's really exciting to me, and that also shows me something that we're doing well. And I'm excited to kind of pick apart what specific interventions we've engaged in within the fellowship systems that have led to these results, so we can continue to refine them and hopefully see even better results in the future.
And I'll add on to that. Thank you for that, Tanwi. I think one of the things that is both validating and helps us to really think critically about how we can have the greatest impact from this study is really seeing that when students come into a program that explores the impacts of the food system from a number of different lenses, they really start to broaden their perspective and become able to identify with the issue in a different way. So we saw that we've had students who came into the program really identifying with the environmental impacts of factory farming or social justice or animal protection. But when they come out, they really have a much broader understanding of how all of the different issues work together, and they're able to talk from all of these different perspectives, and they're able to then speak to different audiences who have different interests and come from different backgrounds. And so I think that that's just really useful for us to know and think about, because we're always trying to think about who are these students who are most likely to go on and have the biggest impact possible. And I think that it can be really easy for us to assume that somebody who is vegan, for example, is going to be the most likely to have an impact. And I think that this shows that we really need to challenge that thinking, and help to develop students, fellows, individuals who are really able to see these issues holistically and understand the broader impacts, and then be able to have conversations with lots of different people who care about lots of different things.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned, Lauren, in that answer, which is this idea of lenses. There were a couple questions in the chat about lenses. And I think if you don't understand what this lens is, it can be hard to picture. I know sometimes it is for me. When I say the word lenses in this context, I mean basically different perspectives of looking at the same issue. And in this case, it's usually factory farming. So both of you, since you work so much in education, have so much experience, could you maybe give us an example of one issue and how you would look at that from different lenses, or perhaps how you would explain it to a classroom of students, for example, like say, chicken farming or capos or whatever it happens to be. I think this can help understand what we mean by intersectionality and different lenses for either of you.
Yeah, I can start, and then Tanwi, feel free to jump in. So I think one way to think about this is, so we go into classrooms all around the US and teach about the impacts and implications of factory farming. And we're invited in by teachers from all different subject areas. So we might be invited in by a history teacher. We might be invited by an environmental studies teacher. And we're really able to kind of integrate into the curriculum of that teacher in lots of different ways, which I think perfectly explains sort of what you're talking about here, Bjorn. So we might get invited into an environmental studies class that's doing a unit on pollution, for example, and we'll be talking about the impacts of a chicken or a hog farm, for example, on the environment. We could also look at that issue from a social justice lens in terms of how is the community where that factory farm is located impacted. We could also look specifically from an animal protection lens at the welfare conditions of the chickens within that factory farm. And so our educators, when we're in the classroom, do try to bring all of these different pieces into every single lesson, but the framing of this lesson differs depending on what the subject of the class is about, and how it's being integrated into that particular lesson. But we then really try to build to understand sort of that full picture. And sometimes it might be that there's a series of classroom lessons that we're giving where we're able to talk to all of these different angles in depth. But I guess that just sort of gives an example of the way in which this issue is so multifaceted, and there's so many different angles, is another word, that we can talk to and lead from in order to sort of unpack the implications. Tanwi, is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah, and I'll add that I think we kind of carry this principle into our fellowship programming as well. When we engage in the intensive educational portions of our fellowships, we also attempt to bring this same concept of being able to look at the issue of factory farming through multiple lenses into that programming. So again, fellows are learning about the impacts of factory farming on public health and on communities and on animals and on the environment. And through this, I think we're able to connect with them as individuals, because we're able to kind of touch on everything. There's something that resonates with everybody. There's issues that everyone cares about, that will kind of drive them into action. And we're also able to bestow them with the skills to do the same when they go out into their own communities. So when we have a student, for example, who's going to dining administration and asking them to make changes to the campus cafeterias, they're able to identify through conversation with these individuals what is it that this community or this individual cares about? And then when they ask for their change, they're able to put it through that lens. So they're able to frame it as like, oh, this will help you meet your sustainability goals. Oh, this is, in line with your community initiatives that you're already undertaking. Or, this is something that makes sense for you to institute as a department whose values should be in line with like so-and-so principle that is touched by factory farming, and pretty much everything is touched by factory farming. So I think that's one of the other really powerful aspects of the programming, and a principle that I think we've been able to take from our educational outreach and put into action and also impart to our fellows.
Great answer. I think that helps us understand the goals of the programming really well. And I like, Tanwi, how you explained it's not just about explaining things to students, then the students have these tools to then make it a part of their advocacy. Very nice. I'm seeing a couple of questions about demographics. In our analysis, we didn't break this down by demographic, but I think in future analyses, it might be more possible to do so in regards to the sample size. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for those questions at the moment. I do want to ask a question from Justin about scaling the knowledge sharing and skill building. And I think this is one of the interesting challenges of a program like New Roots Institute. Whereas if you're talking one-on-one or maybe one on a classroom, for example, it can be really easy to build up people's understanding, knowledge, and advocacy and skills and all of this great stuff we've been talking about. But how can this be scaled up? Because if you have one person talking to 2,000 people, suddenly the message might be a lot more difficult. How do you approach this at New Roots? Are you thinking about scalability? Are you focusing small? Just talk to us about that, because I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I can kick off here. This is definitely something that we think a lot about. And one of the things that we're thinking about and working on is how we empower our fellows to be the ones who carry this knowledge and training forward. So we mentioned that we have educators in 7 hubs across the US. The idea is that our fellows are going on to be the educator in all of the areas that they're in. So in this past fall, all of our fellows who are part of our academic year fellowship were trained in delivering presentations like our educators do. They then went on to practice delivering those presentations to close family members, to peers, and started to slowly challenge themselves in the delivery of that. So our fellows really are the way that we can scale across the US and reach different areas. In addition to that, also thinking about when we're changing the environment as well, it just makes it easier for other people to make a choice that doesn't support factory farming. So if we have a fellow who goes through, let's say, Cornell University and is able to change the choice architecture or get plant-based defaults introduced, even long after they're gone, those impacts are remaining as well. So really thinking strategically about the ways in which we're both empowering our fellows to continue to communicate and deliver the message, as well as thinking about how they can create structural change that long withstands them actually being physically present in a particular location as well. So definitely something that we're thinking about, and definitely lots of learning still to come around how this can continue to scale over time.
Okay, I think we have time for one final question here. Are there any plans to do a similar study? So both of you have talked about how this makes you more curious about learning more about these programs. At the moment, Faunalytics, we haven't decided our upcoming slate of studies, but we will later this year. I can't speak to what we will choose, but we don't have any current plans as of this time to study this further. Again, that might change with our future research prioritization. But for Tanwi and Lauren, what so even if you're not thinking about studying this further, perhaps you can also answer what questions do you think you still have that haven't been answered yet that you think are worth investigating?
We have a lot of questions that we need to investigate further. I think one of the things that this has really helped us to do, we've also recently brought on a full-time data and research manager as well, is really being very deliberate in the through line with all, we do a lot of surveys with our students at the start of the term, at the middle of the term, at the end of the term, 6 months after they've graduated, etc. And so being really deliberate about that through line to understand the impact that the programming is having. So I think one of the things that this survey was primarily done immediately after fellows graduated from the Leadership Academy. So looking longer term here as well, what happens 6 months after someone graduates? What happens 12 months after someone graduates? How are they carrying these learnings forward? How is it impacting the ultimate career choices that they make? What is the advocacy that they're able, the impact that they're able to have within the spheres that they're working in? How are they continuing their advocacy long term? So I think there's still sort of a lot of longer term impacts that we need to look into more, that we've got questions about.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much for being here. If anybody in the audience has questions about this study, you are free to reach out to us at Faunalytics. If you have questions or want to chat with some folks at New Roots, I'm sure that they are open as well to talking about their work. In the meantime, I hope this was influential, and I hope that this study helps you not just understand New Roots as an organization, but how the principles of New Roots fellowships and programs can be applied to the larger movement to make the movement more sustainable, influence students, help our messages, make it more intersectional, and all of these great things. Thank you all for attending, and I'll see you at our next webinar next month with Faunalytics. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bjorn.
Thanks for having us, Bjorn.